Why DDoS someone? And I do want to talk specifically about DDoS here, because again, this is the most common variant of denial of service attack that we see today. And it turns out there are many different reasons why DDoS attacks are mounted. Let's go and take a look at a few of them now. Gaming is one place where we see a lot of DDoS attacks happening. And in fact, we see it in a couple of different areas of gaming. So one is attacks against gaming services, and the other one is attacks against gaming opponents. Let's run through these two. A really good example of why a gaming service would be attacked is attackers like Notoriety. Earlier on, I mentioned attacks against Xbox, PlayStation Network, Steam. Attackers love taking down these services, and in fact, they've been particularly effective at taking them down right at Christmas time. Christmas 2015 and Christmas 2014 both had really serious attacks against these gaming networks. They made the networks unusable for many people. And one thing that's often been said about attackers who decide to launch this class of attack, particularly at that time of year, is that it's a Grinch syndrome. They just like being antagonistic. They like watching their victims squirm and complain on social media about how they can't play their games. And certainly we've seen cases in those last couple of Christmases where the attackers have clearly gone out and deliberately antagonized the victims, even beyond the DDoS attack themselves. For example, using social media to taunt them. This is simply an online version of your classic playground bully. One of the things about gaming in particular is that it's very emotive, and when we see players unable to gain access to their games, it does amplify frustrations. They're a lot more upset than if they couldn't, say, use their favourite shopping site. Probably even a lot more upset than if they couldn't use their bank. And again, we've seen that in the PlayStation Network, and we've also seen it hit the Steam network. If recent history is anything to go by, we'll see this style of attack happen many more times yet. Now, the other style of DDoS in gaming attack I mentioned was against gaming opponents. And online games have become enormously popular in recent years, even in a professional capacity. With the growth of online games, we are seeing the growth of DDoS attacks against gaming components. And the key reason why attackers want to mount this style of attack is to try and slow down their opponents. If you're playing an online game and you're heavily dependent on an internet connection that keeps you connected to a server and allows you to compete against other players in remote locations, the speed at which you can communicate with that gaming server is absolutely critical. If things halt, someone comes along and shoots you, or you crash your car, or you miss that goal, because the game has continued on around you. Everyone else is fine. The gaming service is fine. It's just that your connection has been degraded such that it may make it impossible to play. This style of attack has become so prevalent that Riot Games has even had to produce a DDoS prevention guide. So that's DDoS in gaming. Another motivation we see for mounting DDoS attacks is revenge. So a really good example of this is Lizard Squad, taking revenge on the UK police. Now, paradoxically, they were mounting a DDoS attack against the police for having arrested 6 teenagers who were found to be buying access to Lizard Squad's own DDoS service. Now, really, this is just a form of protest. It doesn't have any long-lasting impact on the police. It doesn't disclose any sensitive data. It just makes the service unavailable for a short period of time. In fact, there are many people that are quite adamant that a DDoS should never even be called a hack. And indeed, it really doesn't rely on actually hacking anything within the target service itself. It's just like that pizza shop example. They're just making lots of phone calls, sending lots of requests. Yes, they are having an adverse impact on that target service, but in a case like this, it's not much more than a digital equivalent of throwing your toys. Now, as much as we see DDoS attacks launched against law enforcement, we've also seen DDoS attacks used by law enforcement. In fact, specifically, we've seen the United Kingdom's GCHQ. So this is the British Intelligence and Security Organisation. Think about it as the NSA in the United Kingdom. And as we can see from the headline here, some of the leaks that came from Edward Snowden disclose the fact that the GCHQ was actually using DDoS attacks against hacktivists. Now this actually caused quite a stir because in most countries, a DDoS attack is actually a criminal offence. But of course, law enforcement may well have valid reasons for using it in order to protect national security. And indeed that appeared to be the case here. It's just interesting how this class of attack isn't necessarily used only by online criminals or hacktivists. It may well be used by this class of adversary that we know as a nation state. Another way we often see DDoS attacks being used is to create a diversion. And in fact, what we see here is DDoS attacks occurring and then resources being tied up fighting that DDoS attack, being very, very focused on that particular threat. And in the meantime, attackers mounting other attacks against systems which now have eyes diverted from it, whilst the defenders are focused on the DDoS attack. So for example, we often see DDoS attacks coinciding with the arrival of malware or social engineering or other attacks against applications, such as something like a SQL injection attack. This style of attack is almost like DDoSing the humans. So the humans that are there to defend these systems get tied up, focusing on defending against the denial of service attack, such that they're unable to perform their normal duties and defend the other parts of the environment. Another area we've seen DDoS attacks mounting in recent years is for extortion. So think about how this would work, and this example of Greece banks is a really good precedent. So here we have a situation where attackers are targeting a service and saying, if you don't pay us money, we're going to keep your system offline. So this is simply an extortion racket. The attackers are asking for a ransom, and they were targeting multiple Greek banks and asking for $5 million from each of them. That's about $7 million US from each one of these banks they were targeting. So you can see how high the stakes are here as well. If the attackers genuinely believe that this class of attack was worth that much money, and of course if they could actually get the target bank to pay it, that would be a very, very rewarding exercise. But when you think about it for a moment and you consider the amount of trade that goes through a bank, the amount of money a bank makes, £5 million may be a small drop in the bucket in order to be able to keep doing business, even just for a day or two. This is a really good example of where DDoS makes sense for criminal actors. So attackers who are there with the express intent of making money out of this class of incident. But there's another class of attacker I want to talk about. It's the last one I want to talk about in this section on motivations for DDoS. And it's these guys. Hacktivists. DDoS is enormously popular with hacktivists. When we get to the module on tools and services, I'm going to show you one tool in particular that's featured really heavily when we talk about this class of threat actor. A really good example of this is the anonymous attacks that happened under the banner of Operation Payback, or Op Payback as the hashtag went. And this was in response to a whole bunch of financial institutions denying supporters the ability to donate to WikiLeaks. So Op Payback mounted DDoS attacks against the likes of MasterCard, PayPal, Visa, even the Swedish prosecution authority that was pursuing Julian Assange for alleged crimes committed in Sweden. These attacks were actually quite effective. They took down financial institutions for periods of time. And the DDoS attack worked because there are so many people involved in this loose collective known as Anonymous, all contributing to the DDoS attack by mounting their own single attacks from their own individual environments, but multiplied thousands and thousands of times over, such that it actually had a real-world impact on these target sites, big financial institutions at that. That was back in 2010, so quite some time has gone by now. Yet even today, DDoS remains one of the favourite tools of hacktivists, and not a month goes by where we don't see this class of attack against a target site. There's one final note to make on DDoS and hacktivism. It's a really easy class of attack, and the attacker doesn't need to be very sophisticated. They're often guided through how to do it by other hacktivists coercing them into mounting the attack. And what many hacktivists don't realize is this. In response to episodes like Operation Payback, a bunch of people were arrested, some people went to jail. It is a serious criminal offence. And when you think back to that slide I had on what makes denial of service attacks so effective, the ease with which they're mounted, the low cost, and then you consider hacktivists are very often young people, very often still legally children, not yet aware of the real-world consequences of their actions, you can see how something like this happens. A bunch of kids open up a free tool, point it to a target website, and then just forget about it until the police come knocking. So DDoS remains enormously prevalent in hacktivism, and certainly it has also been very effective. Let's move on and look at another style of denial of service attack, and that's the kind that was never intended to happen.